Hello, everyone, and welcome. This is Pharmacy Compound, and this will supplement Chapter 3 of the Wood-Burns text. Let's get started. So these are the objectives to distinguish pharmacy compounding from manufacturing, including to distinguish between a 503A compounding pharmacy and a 503B outsourcing facility. And then we're going to recognize the circumstances when the Food, Drug, Cosmetic Act enforcement exemptions for 503A, B, and or repackaging pharmacies apply. So for compounding, please read the book. It's a handful of pages. However, it provides a historical background, and that information helps paint a picture to how we got to where we are today and why our current structure is what it is. This course provides really just a basic intro to the compounding space and the legal issues as it pertains to pharmacy practice. Compounding is really, it's grown a lot over the last decade or so. It's deeply rooted in our profession, as we all know. However, because of a recent tragedy, it has really even been in the legal space a lot more. But I'm just touching on it, and there's a lot more out there. So if you're going to be involved in compounding, you're going to have to learn a lot more about it. This is really just touching on it to the basics, okay? So what's in the textbook is really just a background. I understand it's confusing because there's decades and decades of legal cases. There's been a good number of compounding errors and problems and cases out there. There's been legal amendments to the Food, Drug, Cosmetic Act. There's been federal and state issues. There's been constitutional arguments. Who's in charge? The feds, the state. That's gone back and forth. Unfortunately, because of all this, that ended in, well, not because of all this, I mean, there was some criminals involved too, but it ended in a tragedy, or unfortunately, we had to have a tragedy occur in 2012 that basically let us finally come to a conclusion of we have to do something different. So, summaried or summarized maybe in an FDA press release in 2018, I think you can read. So in 2012, because of New England compounding tragedy, that was a pharmacy um, in Massachusetts that basically 753 patients in 20 states were diagnosed with a fungal infection after receiving injections from a preservative-free methylprednisolone acetate injection that were shipped from this pharmacy in New England. And of those patients, the CDC reported that 64 of them had passed away. But since that time frame of 2012, further looking into it, actually more than 100 patients unfortunately passed away. So the owners actually and others there were actually convicted of crimes. I mean, obviously a ton of lawsuits I'm sure occurred, civil and stuff like that, administrative, but criminally charged too as well. Federal jury came back and found because of this there was a ton of stuff going on, but these defendants went to jail. So the outbreak, according to the FDA, was the largest public health crisis ever caused by a pharmaceutical drug. So they said, of course, these were professionals who acted recklessly to the extreme detriment of public health. Over the course of the years, they callously disregarded patient health by cutting corners and prioritizing profits over safety. They got away with it by defrauding federal and state regulators. The result was contaminated, deficient, deadly drugs that never should have been made or distributed. So remember those terms we learned: adulterated, contaminated, right? Misbranding, I'm sure those were involved. A key aspect of the FDA's mission is to ensure that the drugs are made under high quality conditions to prevent patient harm due to poorly compounded products. This episode was a tragic reminder of why compounding and compounded drugs can present serious risks, and they've taken new steps to ensure the quality of drugs and improving patient safety. So we did not have a structure currently in our federal or state systems to protect against something like this, and a lot of it went back to the lawsuits that we had prior over who's in charge, feds or states, in terms of compounding and who regulates it. So something had to change. So that's what happened. So after that, we then had the DQSA of 2013. That was the Drug Quality Security Act, and that then left the FDA along with state oversight. And with that, over the last decade, we have now had the amendment, we've had rules and regulations, we've had lots of guidance documents. It is still a work in progress, so we will see things moving forward as well too. If you're interested in reading more, there's a book out there called Kill Shot. Here's some summaries out there on some websites about it. There's articles out there about it. Just give you a couple links. Some came out immediately after it occured. ISMP put one out that actually lists a number of the compounding errors over the years. Excuse me. And then also there's some other pages out there too. So you can Google it and find tons of information. So if you're interested in reading or learning more about it, there's a lot of information out there. So just talking about compounding in general, though, obviously New England Compounding Center and that tragedy is a horrible event. Like I said, that was, the FDA said it was the largest one in terms of that, public health in terms of that. But we just want to go back to compounding in terms of looking at what does that mean to our profession and what do we have to think about, how it's regulated now, and what do we have to do to make sure that we're compliant. So what is compounding? Okay, so this is how the FDA looks at compounding and defines it. Okay, so it's regarded as the process of combining, mixing, or altering ingredients to create a medication tailored to the needs of an individual patient. It includes the combining of 2 or more drugs. They are not FDA approved. So what that means is when you pull a drug from a manufacturer off the shelf that has that label on there, and we looked at in chapter 2 how that has to be approved. There's a new drug application, the FDA approves it, it's made in an FDA approved facility that meets current good manufacturing practices. That label on the commercial product is approved, comes with the labeling, right? All that stuff there meets certain standards. We know that. But when you take a couple of drugs and you mix it together, you're now making a drug that's not FDA approved, okay? That's a compounded drug. When you make that drug, does that have to go through the drug approval process? Well, according to the FDA, they could make that go through that drug approval process, but they're not going to do that, okay? Because that would be horrible if we all had to do that, and it wouldn't be feasible. But they know that patients need some drugs like that because there's just some drugs not on the market that are made like that. So there's some good in compounding too, all right? So where can we find the balance there of, hey, there are some commercial products, but there's also a time when commercial products aren't available and or aren't the proper route to go. So there are some positives to compounding, but at the same time, we want to protect patients from what we saw with New England compounding. So a drug may be compounded for a patient who cannot be treated with an FDA-approved medication, like a commercial product, like if they have an allergy to a dye, or if there's some other issue, or if they can't swallow a tablet or capsule. All right, so there's times where an FDA-approved product is not the best thing available for a patient. Or maybe it's on back order. Okay, or maybe it's not available. And actually, we just saw that recently with Wegovy and a couple other ones for weight loss. There was a huge back order on it, right? So I say huge back order, I guess a back order is a back order. There wasn't availability of it, I guess. So when something like that happens, a patient can't get it from the manufacturer, but I guess if the raw ingredient is available, then you can do some compounding on it possibly. So that is a possibility as well. So as I mentioned, they're not approved by the FDA, so they don't verify, the way they do a commercial product. So what are the risks with compounded drugs? Okay, so by no means am I saying that pharmacy is, a shady shop or the pharmacists in there are bad people or anything like that. But if you have a facility that, meet certain FDA standards, meet current good manufacturing practice, goes through all these steps, right? Hopefully you see the benefit of that product versus walking into a pharmacy that does not go through all those steps. That's what I'm trying to say. So think about pharmacy compounding on the one end, on the left-hand side here. We'll call that traditional compounding. Just think about this as your local independent store, right? You go to a dermatologist, you get a prescription for 2 creams to mix together. You take cream A and cream B. When you mix those together, just say a 1-to-1 ratio, you come up with this new compound of cream C. Okay, it's not available commercially, but the doctor wants you to have these two together. He wants the pharmacist to mix them, put them in a little vial for you, take it home, you're now putting that on. No, that is now a new product, the FDA says, but they're not going to make you prove it if you meet certain things. So you don't have to go through the new drug approval process. You don't have to do all that, but they want you to meet certain requirements, and we're going to talk about what that is. That's traditional compounding, all right? On the other side of the arrow is manufacturing. Then we have this whole spectrum in the middle, and this is the gray area. At what point does your traditional compounding start creeping down and start becoming more of a manufacturing type activity? Because at some point, it's going to cross down there, and you got to start then being treated like a manufacturer. And the manufacturer is the one that has to be FDA inspected. They have to register. Their drugs have to be approved. They have to meet current good manufacturing practices, right? That's what I was talking about earlier. So think about this line here. Do you want to be a traditional compounder that you're not regulated like a manufacturer, or do you want to be regulated like a manufacturer? So obviously traditional compounding is still regulated. They're just not regulated at the level of a manufacturer. So traditional compounding is exempt, okay, exempt from a lot of things that a manufacturer has to meet, okay, but they're not given the authority to do everything that a manufacturer can do, all right? So that's what we get into here is what can traditional compounders do. We don't want them crossing certain lines because then they're going to have to meet certain requirements. We're also going to talk about repackaging at the end too, because repackaging falls under this concept now as well. So after this NECC tragedy, as I said, the Drug Quality Safety Act Title I, which is the Compounding Quality Act, because there's also a track and trace element there too, and I should mention that. So just the DQSA is just not compounding. So I apologize for not pointing that out before. Created a new section, what we call 503B of the Food Drug Cosmetic Act. So when you hear 503B, that applies specifically to this new category of what we call outsourcing facilities. So that is the type of facility, outsourcing facility, excuse me, which could be a pharmacy that has to meet more standards to do things, versus our traditional pharmacy, which we already had an existing list for that that the FDA used to apply, but then went through some legal battles and was found unconstitutional for other reasons. So that was already in place at one point. That's called a 503A. So we are gonna, they reinstated that. So that was already in place at one point, but like I said, it was under some legal battles. So that was reinstated. So a traditional pharmacy is considered a 503A. So when you hear 503A, you think, oh, that's the traditional pharmacy. That's me walking in with my prescription from my dermatologist to my independent pharmacy. They're going to mix my cream A and my cream B, and they're going to give me this cream. I'm going to go home and put it on at night, right? As long as the pharmacy meets certain standards, right, they're not going to be treated like a manufacturer. The 503B is this new entity, is not quite a manufacturer, but they're somewhere on that gray line that I showed you. So let's focus on the 503A first, right? Because you're practicing pharmacy, you don't want to be a 503B up the scale. You definitely don't want to be a manufacturer. Okay, you want to stay down on that 503A side of the traditional pharmacy. You want to be exempt from being treated like a 503B facility, which has to be more like a manufacturer. They have to meet certain things. And you want to be exempt from being a manufacturer. All right, what do you have to do? This is your list of things that you must do at your pharmacy to be considered a 503A. When you do these things here, you will be exempt from the FDA coming in and enforcing requirements against you that you have to meet that are like you being a manufacturer. So what are you exempt from? They will not make you meet adequate directions for use of your new drug that you're making. They will not make you meet current good manufacturing practices, which manufacturers and 503Bs have to meet, and they will not make you go through the new drug approval process. They're exempting you from that. Now, do you have to meet other requirements? Absolutely. Do you have to meet USP 795 and 797? Absolutely. So it's not that you don't have to meet requirements. It's just those are manufacturer requirements. You do not have to do those. Okay. So what is it that you have to do to be exempt from those? So you have to be getting individualized patient prescriptions. So Mrs. Smith is walking in from the dermatologist. You're filling that compound of A and B cream together for Mrs. Smith. You have an identified individual patient. Now we'll see that you can make certain medications in advance of expecting patients to come in, because if you typically do 5 patients a day, 5 patients a week, right? Instead of doing it every single time a patient comes in, you might be able to anticipate that. That might be okay, okay? So there's exceptions to that. But in general, you are making them for patients. You're not making a big tub of it to sell to a doctor's office, or you're not making it to distribute to another healthcare facility. You're making it specifically for patients, all right? A pharmacist or a pharmacy is going to make it. That should make sense. That anticipatory compound I just mentioned, we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but that's allowed. You have to follow USP chapters. Again, I'm not going to test you on the specific USP chapters and what all these requirements are, but you have to meet USP 795, USP 797, USP 800, right? Those are the compounding chapters. You have to meet those. You also have to use proper bulk substances. The FDA has bulk substances list. Trying to think if the guidances are final on those or not, but they were in the process of making approved bulk substances. I do not think those are complete, or they're probably an ongoing list. But when you compound, you need to refer to these bulk substances list, although I think they're in process. So you want to make sure whatever products you're using when you're compounding meets whatever the FDA wants. You don't want to use products that are considered dangerous or have been removed from the market or anything like that. Hopefully all that makes sense. The compounder can't compound regularly or in inordinate amounts what are considered essential copies of commercially available products. So again, if there is a product already made by a manufacturer that is registered with the FDA that meets CGMPs, right? You shouldn't be making it. Now, there's going to be times where a patient needs something maybe without a dye or can't swallow that capsule or something. So there might be a need, a patient-specific need for you to do that. Okay, that's okay. You're going to document that and say, hey, Mrs. Smith can't take the commercial product because it has a red dye in it and she's deathly allergic to red dye or something like that, right? That's okay. Or there might be like, hey, this drug is on back order and it's expected in a month and Mrs. Smith is out of it. So we compounded it, excuse me, excuse me, we compounded this month for her. That's okay. There's going to be exceptions, right? But in general, it's going to be, you're not going to be making commercial products, okay? So the FDA has given guidance, documents on these things to help us understand exactly what is it. What's considered a commercially available product? When is something not available commercially? What is anticipatory compounding? And things like that. So I have a slide on that later. Then we have this thing called a memorandum of understanding. At this point, you don't have to worry about that. The FDA through NABP came out with one, but they've suspended this. This is where they're going to want the states and the FDA to work together, and depending on how much is crossing state lines and stuff, there's certain types of communication and reporting, but there was an appeal with that, so that had to go through rulemaking. And like I said, there's uh, let's just say it's still being worked on. So there's nothing finalized to report on it yet. So as of right now, you don't have to work on that, but at some point there's probably going to be a memorandum of understanding between the state and the FDA, and there's going to have to be some kind of agreement between them to do some kind of communications. So anyways, there's plenty of guidance documents out there to clarify what all this means. Some of them are already available and finalized, some aren't. Okay, 503A, very important. Traditional compounding pharmacy. This is what you want to be able to meet these requirements to not have certain parts of the Food Drug Cosmetic Act enforced against you. This MOU requirement, like I said, was being worked on by the NABP. It was put out there. States were signing on. There was a lawsuit. The lawsuit found that the FDA did not go about it the right way, so they had to go back and make rulemaking. It's currently, the time I'm actually taping this, it's suspended. If you want to learn more, you can go to that website. So at this point, just know that there's an MOU. It's going to come at some point down at a later time, but you don't need to know any specifics about it right now. So moving on to Section 503B. So this is the new section under the Food, Drug, Cosmetic Act that was created because specifically of the NECC. This is specifically to avoid what happened with NECC, because they were making bulk product basically, not specifically for patients. They were shipping out for other facilities, other like healthcare facilities to use on patients. And there is a need for things like this to occur in other facilities. Maybe the facility doesn't have the proper rooms to be able to make products like this. Maybe they don't have, it's a small rural hospital and they can't or something. Because you need certain types of equipment to make certain types of products, right? So there is a need to have outsourcing facilities, okay? So, so to avoid or to try and avoid or prevent what happened, this is defined as a facility that is registered with the FDA, engaged in compounding of sterile drugs, and complies with the 503B requirements. So what are those requirements? So again, this entity, 503B, is going to be exempt from some of the requirements that a manufacturer has to meet. Not all, but some. But they have higher standards than a 503A pharmacy, okay? But they're engaging in things that are more risky than a 503A pharmacy as well. So the big thing is they do have to comply with current good manufacturing practices. So this is things that a manufacturer has to do, and I mentioned them before in chapter 2. A manufacturer has to do this, but a traditional pharmacy does not. So that's a whole nother set of FDA requirements, rules, if you will, that have to be met. So this is where I was saying that if, because a pharmacy could be a 503B facility as well, or a 503B outsourcing facility. So this is somewhere where the pharmacy could cross over and also be doing a manufacturing type activity and have to comply with the current good manufacturing practices. Now, there's not a lot of 503B facilities out there, outsourcing facilities, so most likely your pharmacy is not going to be involved with this, but this is where, like I said, it could be that you might be involved in something with this. But if you're 503B, you got to be compliant with current good manufacturing practices. That is a big difference between a 503A and a 503B. Also, like I said, you're registering with the FDA. You're going to allow FDA inspections according to a risk-based schedule. You're going to prohibit the sale transfer of products by an entity other than the outsourcing facility. You're going to meet the DQSA labeling requirements for each container. You're going to meet other FDA requirements such as reporting adverse events and disclosing product information. So there's more oversight of a 503B. They have to meet more requirements than a 503A, but they don't have to be treated exactly at the same standard as a manufacturer. So they fall in between a traditional and a manufacturer. So they fall somewhere on that line, okay? So they're still exempt from some things like adequate directions for use, the FDA labeling, all right? So they're still exempt from some things, but not all the things that I mentioned, okay? They are also allowed to, so 503As are not allowed to make for office use. So like I said, if it had to be a patient-specific prescription. So if a doctor's office were to call and say, hey, pharmacy, can you please make me a product mixing drug A, B, and C together? I'm going to use it for office use because I do procedures and I'm going to use it for patients before office use. Traditional pharmacy has to say no because they have to make it for patient specifics. Now, the doctor can send the patient in with a prescription, and then the patient can take that prescription into the doctor's office and use it before their procedure. But to make it and then just sell it to the doctor's office, that's not for a patient specific prescription. So a traditional pharmacy has to say, I'm sorry, I can't do it. All right. But a 503B, because they're an outsourcing facility, actually can. All right. So they are allowed to compound non-sterile drugs in addition to sterile products, and these can be dispensed or can be, I guess it's more of a distribution, if you will, to um, you can sell to patients as well, but you can also um, do uh, requests for like prescriber offices as well. Okay. So the DQSA requires the FDA and states to work together. As I said, again, that's going to be the MOU, but obviously it's important that they work together anyways. Um, like I said, the FDA has to publish a drug list for drugs that are removed from the market and the bulk drug substances. As of 2023, there was less than 80, about I think 78 or 79 503B pharmacies or outsourcing facilities in the U.S. After NECC, many states recognized that they too didn't have good regulations oversight, including Massachusetts where this happened. So, they had to update or they had to pass rules and regulations too. So many states have their own oversight of compounding. So always check your state because what do they require? It might be in addition to whatever this is. It might be what this is. So you really have to look at your state too. But remember, state law can't conflict with federal law. Remember, when you compound, you got to meet the BEUD requirements because you're taking things out and you're altering them, you're putting them together. So what does your state law say? What does the package insert say if you're taking commercial products, right? What does 795 say? What does 797 say? So you have to look at whatever you're doing and whatever the standards out there are. 797 and I'm sorry, yeah, 795 and 797 at the time I recorded this were actually just updated. They were updated, they were appealed. They went through a process. That process was approved. The enforcement of those were November of 2023. So do states now enforce that or do states have their own standards? Again, you have to look and see what is the standard out there for the product you're making. There's multiple things to look at. You got to look at the drug, you got to look at the inserts, you have to look at the product, you have to look at 795, you got to look at 797, you got to look at what your state's doing. So I can't sit here and tell you exactly what standard it is. You have to do your research, but just know that 797 and 795 have the most recent versions have been updated, approved, and are being enforced. The FDA has a lot of resources on compounding. There's, like I said, a bunch of guidance out there. There's additional information. So there's all these little topics that pop up, all these issues. Many of them are outside the scope of this class. You can refer to the FDA for additional information. There's also compounding associations, compounding societies out there, groups and organizations you can join or belong to. A lot of helpful information at various FDA websites. Like, for example, I give you a couple here. Obviously, the guidances are available on the FDA website. In addition to human drug compounding, which I'm focusing on here, there's also veterinary compounding, and there's been some movement on that recently too. So keep that in mind. So just some things to think about. I do have on the next few slides some examples of information of these two links before I get into repackaging. So let me show you those. So those links I gave you on the prior slide here, some of them, the FDA has nice little charts. So you can see here, if drugs are compounded in accordance with 503A, you can see that you have to follow the Food Drug Cosmetic Act, but you are exempt from CGMPs, labeling, pre-market approval. That's what I mentioned. If you're a 503BA, you are subject except for, and then it tells you right there. So you can see they have nice little charts. I don't know if that will help you in terms of understanding a little bit better, but you can check out those websites if you want. And then you can see that they have links to understanding the differences between a 503A and B, which I pretty much explained it on these slides. So if my explaining helps you, that's great. If not, you can look at those charts. You can also look at the links. There is a guidance specifically for 503A. I give you that link as well too. This guidance, that list I showed you at the beginning that you have to be considered a 503A and exempt. This is a lengthier document, so maybe reading that, which has the background in it, maybe that will help you if you're still struggling at all. So this is a lengthier document about being considered a 503A and how to be considered exempt for those conditions for the ones I mentioned. So this is additional reading if you're still struggling about 503As and not. Here's additional charts available on the FDA website. So this obviously isn't your study one, but I'm just showing you that these are some resources available on those links. So some people are like, I'm still not seeing it. So maybe seeing it in charts and stuff like that may help you a little bit better. So maybe try and go to that website or read those guidances. Those guidances are really good because they start out with background information, they explain things, and then they go into explaining how and why you have to do certain things. So sometimes, yes, it's reading. You have to start at the beginning, you have to go to the end, but sometimes going through that process, it allows you to see what's going on. Let's turn to repackaging here for a couple minutes. So repackaging will now be discussing how you take a finished drug product from the manufacturer's container and you're going to place it into a different container. This is not reconstituting, this is not diluting, this is not removing a non-sterile drug product such as a tablet or capsule and putting it into a pharmacy vial to dispense directly to a patient. That's dispensing. There is specific needs for this, maybe reducing waste, maybe for specific patient needs at a later time, such as like a long-term care facility or something. Examples of this would be like a unit dose or a blister pack. So sometimes it's done by the manufacturers because they may sell like 100-size bottles, tablets together. Sometimes they may sell it, in blister packs already. So the expiration date would be on there. Sometimes it's done by a distributor, which they would reset the expiration date or the beyond use date themselves. So it just really depends. If you're doing it in the pharmacy yourself and you're taking it out of the manufacturer bottle, then you're doing the repackaging. So you have to worry about this. If you're buying it from the manufacturer, obviously, then you're buying the repackaged product. So, but the repackaging product itself still has to comply with the Food Drug Cosmetic Act. And if you're doing the repackaging, you have to think like, okay, what's the expectations that I have to do to make sure that I'm meeting the Food Drug Cosmetic Act? So, you don't want to misbrand the product, right? You don't want to worry about the labeling and stuff like that as well too. So there is FDA guidance out there. I gave you the link. What I want to focus on with this slide here is the beyond use date. Now, I've already covered beyond use date elsewhere. I had a mini topic on it as well too, but you're going to have to worry about repackaging by pharmacy. Basically, again, there's different things you have to think about. Are you going to look at the labeling, right? Um, um, it depends on the product and labeling. Is it non-sterile? Does it have in-use time? Is it non-aqueous? So you look at that. The FDA says 6 months. The USP says one thing if it's non-aqueous. 795 and 797, right? So there's that's what the FDA actually says too. So look at all these resources. This guidance actually gives an example of in-use time as well too. So you can look at the guidance if you want to just to see an example. So that's what I want to say about that. But remember, repackaging is not dispensing to a patient, right? It would be an example of like putting it into unit dose for like a later time. But as I remember, back to the bird's eye picture of it, when you're taking medication out of really any packaging, or you're doing compounding, or you're moving a drug from one packaging to another, you should always be thinking about the dating of that drug. So as a reminder, I mentioned briefly the manufacturer level, which is the highest level. They have to meet all the Food Drug Cosmetics Act requirements. You know, they got to have their facility, they got to have their drugs approved, the labeling, they have to meet CGMPs. You know, that's the highest level. In pharmacy practice, right, you're probably not going to be at the manufacturing level. If you're going to be at a manufacturer, you're going to be working for a manufacturer, okay? So we're touching on manufacturing requirements in this course. You're understanding it a little bit, but that's really not the purpose of this course. You know, that's drug industry. You might go into drug industry, but you're not going to leave this course with a lot of understanding of drug industry, but just touching on it. Moving down that spectrum would be the outsourcing facility, which has to meet some requirements that a manufacturer does, but not all, but is regulated more than the traditional pharmacy, which is on the other end of the spectrum. So what do they have to do? Well, they do have to meet the current good manufacturing practices like a manufacturer, but they're also exempt from other things like their drug being approved as a new drug, and meeting the requirements of the other ones that was on that list. The traditional pharmacy is not regulated as highly as the outsourcing facility and not as the manufacturing, and they're exempt from other things as well. So I gave you those list of things. And then the repackaging is also required to meet certain exempt lists, or certain things on the list to be exempt, excuse me. So you want to keep all those things in mind. As I said, FDA has guidance on specific compounding issues. The book mentions a good number of them. They might give a little bit of information. They might just provide, there's guidance on it. It's outside the scope of this course, just depending on exactly what the topic is. Like I said, this course is not supposed to be the end all for all this. There's plenty of other information out there. If you need more information or you're going to be practicing in certain areas, I'm sure you know where to find that stuff or who to go to, or at least you can search and find it. So for 503A pharmacies, as I mentioned, they can't compound regularly or inordinate amounts of drug products that are essentially copies of commercially available products. Because if it's made commercially, then you should be giving that to the patients. But there are times, like I said, that there might be a need for still to compound something. One example is when there is a significant difference for a patient, or because there's a clinical need. So for example, let's say there's a commercial product and let's say there's a red dye in the commercial product and the patient's allergic to a red dye. Well, obviously that wouldn't be good to give it to the patient if they're allergic to a red dye. So you could maybe compound it without the red dye, right? So that would be a clinical significant difference for the patient. So you would want to document that on the compounded product that the patient's allergic, the doctor prescribed it without the red dye, it's not available commercially. So now your compounded product is explains why you're not using a commercially available product that has a red dye. Also, what if it's on a drug shortage list? If something's not available, right? Either the patient doesn't have it or you compound it. What's the best case there? Either they go without a medication or you compound it. I think you compounding it would be better than them not having it, right? So again, you would need to document that, but that's where that stands. But once it's back in stock, it's no longer on the shortage list, right? So now you would have to go back to the one at the manufacturer. What if something is a similar strength to a commercially available? Let's say there's a 10% commercially available product, and the doctor says, oh, let's give them a 9% cream. Okay, why does the doctor want a 9% cream? You probably want to call them and say, hey, there's a 10% cream. Why do you want a 9% cream? So what they say is, actually, let's go with 20% just to make it a little bit easier. So let's say there's a 20% cream available and the doctor says, I need a 19% cream. And you call and say, there's a 20%, and they say, nope, I need 19%. Okay, that's very close, right? So is that 19% going to make a clinical difference? I mean, I guess you have to have a discussion with the prescriber. What the FDA says, if there's a similar strength, uh, a similar strength if within 10% of the commercially available product, okay? So compound drug products are essential copies. Similar strength if within 10%. So what they're saying is if it's within 10%, that's a concern. Okay, so if it's outside of that 10%, so if we're looking at a 20% cream, let's say, and 10% of that is 2%. So if it goes down to 18 or up to 22, right? Why would you need something different, I guess is the question. Now, we could see if something's available 20% and the doctor says, I need a 10%, or I need a 12%, or I need a 30%, right? You could see why a 20% would not be sufficient. But if you're getting really close to, 20, 21, 22% or something, that's a little odd. Why? So you would need to probably have a discussion with the prescriber about that. And then compounding 4 or fewer prescriptions. So the FDA, so there might be a reason why you need to compound the commercially available one. Um, again, outside of those other ones. So the FDA might not come after you if there's, but again, you want to document why and stuff, especially with the Wegovy one that was out recently that had the back orders, and obviously that would take it off. But there was some other issues going on and stuff like that, and I know some pharmacies were making it, and they were making sure that they were staying under those 4 as well too. So I don't know how often that comes into play, but that's another thing that they mentioned. All right, so the prescription requirement under 503A. One of the requirements on that list is you have a prescription for an individual patient. So does that mean every single time someone comes in? Well, under the guidance, it says you can do anticipatory compounding. The guidance that they say is, well, it says in that list, the guidance that they give is you can go back and you can look at your records and you can look at the highest amount you did in a 30-day period over the past year. That's how you can anticipate what you need. So let's say the doctor has a cream of a 10% product, and every, month, the highest month you got in the last year, you did a certain quantity. You can use that as your anticipatory quantity. Now, assuming it's stable and there's no problem like that, that's what you're going to base it off of. And now you don't have a specific prescription yet, but you're waiting for one already. So that's what they mean by anticipatory. But you can't make for office use because that's a distribution, but 503B pharmacies can. In summary, we talked about the Drug Quality Security Act and the compounding section under, how there's the federal compounding law, rules, and that was in response to the NECC. I mean, it's not that the federal didn't have anything, but there was some of it was not active because of constitutional fights about it, states and stuff like that. But we've pretty much clarified all that. We have our current structure with some guidances out there, with some additional ones on the way. The states and the federal law work together. Again, that's still being evolving. We need to stay up to date, obviously. This is something that's, like I said, is evolving. We've come a long way, let's put it that way, but there's still going to be some more information updates coming along. Various guidance documents, like I said, are available on the FDA website, so you can find them easily. They're there to assist in understanding what's out there, but like I said, we haven't confirmed, or we haven't solidified everything. At least in the pharmacy law space, there's still some confusion about some stuff just because some of this stuff is newer and some things hit and we're not exactly sure how everything works. So things will continue to evolve. Various food, drug, cosmetic exceptions apply to newly manufactured drugs, like approval of drugs, FDA approved labelings, CGMPs, registration. So those are newly manufactured drugs. what about how they apply to compounded drugs and things like that? Well, we want to keep them exempt, right? So what do? We don't want to have to follow CGMPs and things like that. So that's why those guidances and those lists are very important, and we make sure that we follow them. So the 503B and 503A pharmacies, we want them to be exempt from the manufacturer requirements. They're not all going to be, because the 503B we know has to meet CGMPs, but those lists are very important. So I try to point out those lists, those guidances. Um, we want to stay away from the manufacturing side, but we know we have to meet certain conditions. Okay, so we want to stay exempt from the manufacturing requirements, but there's going to be some that we have to meet, like for 503B, for example. But that's kind of where you have to think about, like, hey, how can I stay out of the realm of a manufacturer, um, uh, and still have some requirements, but not as many to meet. Alrighty. And since this was a recording, if you have any questions, write them down. So whenever we see each other next or whatever, we can discuss things later. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.